Pages. It's taken 9 different documents with, and it came alongside a spend. If you're interested now, implement it. It's a 10-year strategy. Actually talking about it and its impacts as we go. And to do all that, we have a fantastic panel with a variety of different reports.
Today's articles about what we're trying to achieve. So now, at the very least, if we disagree with what's in the industrial strategy, we have a plan, that's got to be a good thing. What's in the industrial strategy, we have a plan, that's got to be a good thing. So I'm grateful for that. What I'm hoping to see, though, is application of essentially the strategy we've been following in South Yorkshire now for the last 20 or 30 years. I don't know if anybody's been to South Yorkshire recently. If you haven't, obviously please come. You will see that South Yorkshire, particularly Rotherham, has been one of the fastest growing economies in the whole of the country for the last 20 years alone. So Rotherham productivity growth over the last 20 years is 4.1%, which is, I think, the fastest sub-regional growth of any place in the country. And the reason for that is we have an industrial strategy, and it's been built on Cllr, the site of the Battle of Cllr, what was once a massive coking plant that is now the world's first and world's best advanced manufacturing innovation district, focused on particularly things like low carbon aviation. So we have Boeing's only manufacturing facility in the whole of Europe on the AMRC, we have Cllr, we have Rolls-Royce, all powered through the University, and that is powering growth that we haven't seen for all too long in that area in South Yorkshire. So that sense of purpose and plan is something we've been doing in South Yorkshire for 30 years. I now hope what we have through this industrial strategy is an application of that nationally.
Thank you very much. And next, so Councillor Bev Craig, who's Manchester City Council. Manchester already has one of, if not highest, productivity growth in the UK. How, given your already success, how are you seeing the industrial strategy in building on top of that? What is it going to do?
So morning. So yes, I lead Manchester City Council, and I also lead an economy and business issues right across Greater Manchester as well. So I think from our perspective, we all know a lot about Manchester's growth. We're not too shy in telling you. Nobody will have heard it, and we'll talk about it at length given the chance. But I think we've seen only relative success to the UK story in Manchester. I don't think actually when we talk about Manchester's growth, it's yet comparable to some of the growth we've seen in other European counterparts. And what I mean by that is we've seen great growth in our productivity rates in Manchester and Greater Manchester as a whole, but the gap between London and still sits at 35%. The gap between Paris and Lyon, for example, is 20%. If we were able to close the gap between Paris and Lyon, we'd have over £13 billion to the UK's economy, and overnight up the UK's productivity by 0.7%. So what an industrial strategy and indeed a national infrastructure plan does, in my view, is help accelerate the success stories, be it Rotherham, be it Manchester that you already hear, but with a clear plan and a clear articulation from government as to where those high growth sectors will be. For us in GM, we've taken an approach of intentionality of diversity within our economy. So we're not just growing in one thing, but we're having a multi-layered economy where ecosystems can collaborate with each other and create new opportunities in the future. But having a clear plan that government will back, where money and investment can go to, that lets us say internationally we're all moving as one, I think is really important. And then the final thing I'd say, and the role that infrastructure plays in this, is we've not been great in this country for a very long time planning for the future. We've not always taken the difficult choices that we need to take to invest 20 to 30 years down the line. And I would sort of make a plea that for people in the room that want to see a government with a long-term plan, speak up for it. Because actually at the minute, if you look around us, there's not many other people speaking up for a long-term plan for tomorrow they're talking about today. So we want to see more of this, translating it into what you achieve today to make people see the benefits of growth and change, but also to plan for the future, to plan a country that we can redefine the economy over the next 20 to 30 years.
Thanks, Ben. So, Alice Delahunty, President of UK Transition and National Grid, you obviously have a huge amount of investment all across the country, key enabling infrastructure for lots of things that can happen. How, sitting in National Grid headquarters, do you think about the industrial strategy?
Yeah, thank you. So, sitting here today representing National Grid, in the UK we run the transmission network for England and Wales, we run the distribution network in South Wales, South West and also the Midlands, and we're also the world's largest operator of subsea cables and 6 interconnectors to the UK, so it gives us a really clear perspective and overview of what's happening around the economy and in the energy sector. Therefore, and I always say to my team that ultimately where the electrons flow, the economy will flow. And we take that role in facilitating that economic growth and the progress of the country incredibly seriously. And so when we think about this industrial strategy, the themes that are top of our mind at the moment is one sort of speed, pace and scale. And to echo some of the comments made, you have to plan for that future world where the growth has happened. And so if you start planning with constraints in mind, you're not going to enable that growth. And so that for us means anticipatory investment. It's making decisions about where the growth is going to be and building out infrastructure in anticipation of that growth. Because ultimately, building national infrastructure that goes through people's homes and impacts their lives and is critical and has to be built to this very high level of resilience does take longer than building, for example, a data centre. And so we have to put that up front. The next big thing for us is regulation and the cost controls that we operate in. And there again, it's a theme of workability and pace, taking regulation off the critical path while still protecting the things that are important, such as resilience, cost of delivery, and security for the country. Finally, I think it is important that we're really clear we have made enormous progress in recent years in terms of regulatory frameworks that now enable supply chain development. We've placed multi-billion pound long-term strategic partnerships for offshore cables, converter stations. Tomorrow I will actually be in Sheffield launching an £8 billion supply chain partnership for the building. 8 billion of our £35 billion plan for substation delivery. What that partnership is doing is giving regional partners in every part of the country long-term commitments to developing a workforce in that region for the delivery of substations so that they can build up their skills and resources. So, we have done a huge amount. There is an awful lot more to do, but I think when we think of the industrial strategy and the collective endeavour around the growth mission and the potential for jobs, what it is really clear is that it is about everyone working together, seeing that full system view and having that plan that we can work collectively towards to deliver that.
Fantastic, thanks, Alvis. Virginia, Sentance, Director at Flint Global, heavily involved in the planning of the industrial strategy before we came into government. In your role now, you talk to lots of businesses. The industrial strategy obviously shows some key sectors where it thinks the business succeed, but there were some stories the day after of the hospitality sector, the retail sector saying, what about us? How do you think it's likely with the business needs?
Yeah, so thanks, Sam, and thanks for having me here. I think the challenge that Labour often faces with business engagement is that it's can it handle the economy? And we've all followed basically in terms of the formation of fiscal rules being that sort of key test that Labour can use to say that actually we can handle the economy. It's not a case that that's only something that Conservatives can do. And before the election, we spent a lot of time building those relationships with business, and there's some really positive moments with letters with over 100 businesses supporting Labour in the run of the election. I think the challenge that happens when you go into government, and I should say that my background Labour Together before the election was actually 10 years in the civil service. And the challenge you have is when you get into government, that relationship with business becomes much more transactional. And it might happen gradually, but for Labour with the autumn budget and the NIP decisions, it's happened quite quickly in terms of that pivot from almost a wooing stage to a very different dynamic. And the industrial strategy has played a really key role in helping to manage some of those relationships. And we hear really good things from businesses who feel that the focus in terms of the cross-Whitehall dynamic, in terms of how it's created, being both the Treasury, DDT, DESNES, DSIP programme with Number 10 really pushing it as part of their missions, the alignment with the growth mission and the clean power mission, some of those trade-offs that we thought were going to play out really quite badly has been sort of handled positively. And for me, I guess the key piece underpinning this is the importance of the energy and infrastructure rollout, and some of those the infrastructure plan and the alignment with that, and the British Industrial Competitiveness Scheme announcement that came with the industrial strategy has been a really good part of that. But the challenge comes when you're making an industrial strategy. Really, it's about choices and prioritisation, and there are going to be some potential losers in that. But I think the challenge really has come less from those who don't feel part of the industrial strategy as much as those who aren't seeing the delivery from it. Because of the principles, the alignment with both growth, the growth strategy, clean power, and the industrial strategy, bring that together. There's really not that much, I'd say, missing from the industrial strategy, which we probably will come to in terms of some of those choices. But really now it's about the delivery. So when I speak to businesses, what they're saying is, great, we've got this really brilliant document now that has 500 measures in it. It's got 8 sectors, 8 foundational industries, but what's next? Where's the delivery that's coming? And so that's it's the kind of we're 18 months in, where's the delivery? We've got the nice document.
Fantastic. We have definitely got a good month and really spent a lot of time on that. Next, I'm going to turn to Cllr, Assistant General Secretary of the Trade Unions Congress, long-time champion of industrial strategy and all that it can do, and now member of the Industrial Strategy Council. How do you see the delivery of the strategy, how it's gone, what we're going to have to pivot to next?
Thanks for having me here today. I think there's been this kind of reflection across the panel that industrial strategy has to be long term, but we really need some quick wins, basically to show we're making progress and to give some confidence. So what I thought I'd talk about was 3 areas where I think we can get those quick wins. One, Virginia just mentioned that British Industrial Energy Competitiveness actually titled scheme, which is about bringing down energy costs basically in the short-ish term for businesses. I think we hope the energy transition is going to deliver a sustainable shift to cheaper energy across the UK in the long term. We've got that hump we have to get over, and if there was one bit of feedback for businesses and for workers, particularly in those foundation industries across the engagement part of the industrial strategy, it was about getting those energy costs down. And I think delivering on that, I think it was a big, substantial package the government put in. Many people will still think it isn't big enough, but getting that over the line will actually be the first big win in the industrial strategy that really got to deliver. The second one, I think, again, is about the government keeping putting its money where its mouth is. So decisions like the loan to JLR is absolutely critically important. Saying advanced manufacturing is one of our key industrial strategy sectors. This is what it means to actually decide that an industrial strategy sector and step in and support it when it needs it. You need to protect those jobs in the supply chain. We've also got investments through the National Wealth Fund, we've got the investments through GB Energy, but it's just keeping the money there, as I think everyone on the panel has also said, thinking about that investment that's going into the national energy strategy to support the industrial strategy sector to really help us joined up across the government. And last thing, which is obviously the area I focused on most, and we as the trade union movement focus on most, is how does this actually translate into real skills, real jobs for people across the country? Because that's the point of this all. It's about delivering not just that growth, but that growth which means something for people in terms of decent jobs across the country. And I think we've got a real opportunity here in that the government has said it's going to have a workforce strategy for every industrial strategy sector. That's a really critical commitment. We know we're getting one for the clean energy sector in the forthcoming months. Really great engagement with trade unions on that. But this is our opportunity to actually finally crack that kind of paradox where every business in the UK probably says, well, our biggest challenge is getting hold of the skills we need. At the same time, business investment in skills has halved over the last decade, and we invest half the average amount as half the European average in skills. So this is about actually saying, how do we bring businesses, government, unions together to deliver a plan in those sectors? What are the skills we need in the future? How is technology going to affect them? How can we build that together and actually start showing, particularly in these sectors, and then maybe we can roll it out to some of those other sectors, like retail and hospitality. Workforce strategies don't only have to be for industrial strategy sectors, but how can we really show we've got a plan for jobs, we're training people to get the skills they need to get them, and actually make it makes a tangible difference.
Thanks, Kate. And on the right, we have Nick Williams, former advisor on infrastructure and the economy to the Prime Minister. I was wondering if we could turn slightly to where this sits in how government is thinking about the economy and the wider politics. What is the industrial strategy doing for that, and where does it fit in Labour's political strategy?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for the invitation to join this panel. I think it can't be understated how important the industrial strategy is in this political project. I should say, for my sins, I was also a civil before I joined Labour last year, and I lived through the 2017 Greg Clark industrial strategy from the Treasury, only to then kill it a couple of years later as the Greg Clark is now proposed. Not reflecting my personal views, of course. But the industrial strategy marks a real step change mindset, a shift for the government, and what we see in generating economic growth, away from that sort of laissez-faire model that we have lived with largely for the last 40 years, towards a more strategic stance where we sort of accept the state has a role in taking choices, prioritising, and also taking a bit more risk as well, and doing a bit of planning. So I think that many members of the panel have already talked about the interaction between the industrial strategy and the infrastructure strategy, which I think is absolutely crucial, such that the investment is getting into particularly the city regions and giving the mayors like Ollie the sort of firepower that they need in order to invest. and also for that greenfield investment, they need to know that there's going to be a grid connection, there's going to be a water connection. Their staff will be able to get in and out of the places of work. And so I think this sort of join up between those infrastructure strategies is really important, and I would really encourage the government to go further in setting out greater detail about how the sort of places and sectors are going to sort of marry up together. The UK's position in many of these sectors is falling behind because many of our competitors more strategic stake in partnership with so the regulations are really lined up to the priorities and policy goals of the government rather than sort of code on whichever their policy is thrown to make sure that we are getting the right balance of funding and skills between the individual, the state, and firms. And Kate said, I think this is lots more to do there. And I think one area where the government should look to go further is on innovation, which I think was possibly the area where the industrial strategy was sort of least developed. We've got incredible knowledge centres at our university here. Ollie's got all these catapults at the university that have been an anchor for across the country, and we need to be willing to take a few more and acknowledge that sometimes those big bets are not going to come off, but that's okay because if you do, we're going to dramatically change the prospects of the areas in which they are located. So I think that a few more sort of moonshots to sort of Marianne and Mazepati to sort of into the room. I'm not sure if he's here, but
it's spirit.
It's always in spirit if it's an IPPR and the industrial strategy.
Amazing. So, give your questions to the audience. I'll come to you shortly. As chair's privilege, I have my own. I want to get at this thread of some of the quick wins and Nick's point on opportunity cost. I think from the outside, there is a tendency think tanks and charities and businesses want government to do everything everywhere all at once. And that's not possible. The industrial strategy puts some boundaries in. But it is a 10-year strategy. So I'm interested in where we should make that.
So look, I think there is there's actually a lot of opportunity that just having something written down enables places to go into. I don't think that growth in this country should only be cities, but I think there's an opportunity with cities to go. But I think we also then put a little bit of resource into giving universities and growing up some of this bin lines that we've done to be able to move that. The final thing I'll say is that there are some simple enablers that other bits of government can do to let us fly that the industrial strategy don't need to focus on. One of that is around commercial and building and land remediation. And we've got there with housing. We've got to think about how we fund. If I think about lab space in Manchester, I cannot build it fast enough. We're building it so quickly at the moment, and it's being snapped off, often off spec, before it's even completed. But building in the current environment, without any additional resource nationally that can help us breach that commercial viability gap for lab space or grid offices, something the industrial strategy doesn't need to do. You can have a national loans fund similar to what we do with housing, and you can do that as well.
Thank you. I should say there are people around at the back to hear our thoughts on industrial strategy. There are probably seats in the front if people want to come forward, please do, rather than the back. So let me build on what Bernard said, because I think that's absolutely right about space, but it's also when it comes to things like transport. So in South Yorkshire, what we used to have was a world-class public transport network, and we used to have a model for public transport back in the 1980s and then the 1985 was service that and everything else besides, and came in and all of a sudden over that period what we've had is an absolute destruction of that system, and we're now taking the tram back under public control and having ambitions to extend it, buses coming back under from 2027, but in the meantime what we see is in places like the AMRC, which is, as I say, kind of sits between kind of Rotherham and Sheffield on a place called Parkway, but no public transport infrastructure. And as as a result, you see a constraint on its growth, right? So despite the fact it's one of the fastest growing parts of the country, you can't get a bus there. And so now what the University of Sheffield are doing, quite helpfully, anybody in the room from the University of Sheffield, is introducing parking fees at the AMRC for the staff that work there, because their view is the university, and if the staff have to pay in the campus area, then they should also pay at the AMRC. Well, obviously what we're going to see is a brain drain. So, just stuff like public transport infrastructure is a constraint on the growth, despite the fact it's all the brilliant things in the industrial strategy. Then we just talk about one of the quick wins which I think the government have missed so far, which I have complained about endlessly already, but I will complain about again here, is through the Great British Nuclear competition, the down selection to Rolls-Royce, we had an opportunity with Holtec, American manufacturer, who said they were going to build their factory for building the SMRs that they were promising to build here in this country. A £1.5 billion commitment to create hundreds, if not thousands, of jobs in South Yorkshire, in Doncaster, in fact. And they came second on the down selection list. We thought there might be two, there was in the end one, and that was Rolls-Royce. It was always going to be Rolls-Royce. The idea, I hope, was that we would have been plus one. It wasn't. Rolls-Royce are going to build all of their SMRs probably in Czechia. Now, what that does, and they did it right, they don't complain about that in most ways, because they have been given a contract by the government which prioritises the strike price and doesn't actually look at the wider holistic benefit of building in the UK and creating jobs in places like Manchester. Now, it's not too late in some ways to solve that problem. The government did not show a huge amount of interest in that at the time. And in my view, that would be one of the quick wins that would allow us to get spades in the ground, be able to create jobs in the future industries that are going to power this country. We don't want just 100% of the UK market when it comes to building SMRs. We want 25% of the global market, and that would absolutely power us forward. And that can be done through creating a different contract, which will allow us to say British built is the way that we're going to go in this country. And it might result in a slightly higher strike, but the wider benefits of the economy are.
I'll take your bait on deprioritising and prioritising. So one of the challenges with the industrial strategy is that it creates a space where you feel like you're inside the club, you're outside the club, and the business therefore wants to be inside that club. But the thing is, the government doesn't work like that, and I'm sorry if I'm sort of teaching anyone to suck eggs here on this, but it doesn't work like that. So as Nick says, Greg's industrial strategy was thrown out. But what's really interesting is that the financial services part of that was never thrown out. Treasury has always had its own internal financial services strategy in some way. It's talked about it in different ways, but ultimately it decided that financial services in London is what it was going to care about as a sort of post-Brexit, London growth opportunity, how do you get UK back on the world stage kind of thing. So we end up with this debate about what's in and what's out. But what we're sort of missing a lot of the time is actually that metric about what's the point of being in. And I guess like the piece I think that a lot of Labour's growth strategy really has been about driving inward investment into the UK. That's great because it brings investment into the right places, jobs, etc. But I think the metric we miss or not sort of focus on enough is actually resilience. I was speaking to an EU DG about how they're thinking and framing their similar industrial strategy work, and they called it their national resilience strategy. And that's quite a different perspective, but it actually really resonates with what Alice said about the sort of future-proofing and anticipatory investment. And so I guess like the piece that if I were to be provocative and challenge government would be to say if you set the metric about where that extra intervention is needed to future-proof and create the resilience and security that we need, then you could actually narrow down some of those choices and those priorities. Because, like for me, and I'm intentionally, for Stan's benefit, going to pick two. I think the two spaces around AI and net zero, and that's where we've got this real frontier. We've got a resilience question. We've got vast amounts of Chinese dominance in our supply chains and the security risks that come with that. We've got new technologies coming through, and that's what long term really means to me, as opposed to the sort of looking at where we are now and sort of the backwards looking in terms of our comparative advantages. So there's my provocation to the room.
I absolutely love that. Alice, there's obviously a huge amount going on in networks already. We've had connections reform, we've got the new RIA price framework, government putting huge amounts of money into clean power. Is that enough? Is it broadly on track? Like, is there anything else they need to do to get these quick wins, start getting quick connections moving?
Well, I actually think there's a very, thank you, very good at remembering the microphone, a very good link between the two questions, really. I mean, it's funny you said, I often describe this job, which is an incredible privilege, as the everything everywhere all at once job, because it is the keep the lights on, enable the decarbonisation, facilitate the decarbonisation of legacy industries, enable new industries such as AI ground centres, and so it does all come together, and I think that therefore almost there's a reality here that you cannot do an infinite amount of work on a live piece of critical national infrastructure. And therefore, almost any choices help with clarity and help with pace and help with movement forward. And so, to the question of, is it enough? As I said, I think we have made huge progress, both in connection reforms, in regulatory frameworks that enable anticipatory development, anticipatory construction and investment in the grid. But they have been focused on what we knew, was the priority last year or the year before. So, the enablement of renewables, very specific growth sectors. The reality of things like AI are accelerating the scale even beyond that. So, within our 5-year price control plan, we have about 90 GVA of data centres and strategic demand growth. So to put that in context, that's something like double London's current peak demand. So the scale at which those using energy, not just those producing energy, wants to is really quite extraordinary. And therefore we do have to go even further on agile regulatory framework that is not on the critical path, that is workable, that can allow that responsiveness to the growth areas, that can attract investors for that level of investment. Planning, we haven't talked about planning yet, but that will come back into the frame. There is scope to do more on permitted development rights. So, for example, it would probably surprise you to find out that distribution networks cannot put a third wire on their lines without planning permission. So there are simple kind of further steps on planning, on regulatory, on connections reform, which is largely thinking about the generation side, that will help us go further faster and respond to this challenge.
That's it. So I'm going to turn to the other end of the panel and ask a slightly different question. The industrial strategy came alongside a spending review, big chunk of cash, but also the process of that meant multiple government departments brought in. Had the backing of the Treasury, number 10 very keen on it. Now we're moving toward where we have one industrial strategy at the top, but different departments leading different sectors. I'll start with Kate then Nick. How do we maintain that buy-in across government, allowing departments to do their own thing, but ensuring it's cohesive, sticks together? What do we drive from the centre versus let people go off and do themselves?
So I'm not really a structures of government expert, but I think it is something we think about on the Industrial Strategy Council, basically, like what are the kind of metrics and what are we monitoring, basically. And one thing I've actually learned about from Diane Coyle, who's an expert in these things, she says, you've got to work out, did you do what you said you were going to do? Basically, that's the most important thing. So as everyone's talked about, you've got this really detailed set of commitments. As number one is, have those commitments actually been delivered? Because I think that's also drive confidence. I think there's also something which everyone on the panel will be reflecting about making sure the whole government is really committed to it and understands it, and points about public transport, and not just vital for the industrial strategy, or vital for the industrial strategy. And then I think the points about supply chains, I think, has come across really critically. Government understanding that mapping its supply chains, understanding the power of those supply chains actually to transmit innovation, transmit skills down the supply chain, but also to deliver good jobs. I mean, I genuinely don't have the answer about, is that a cabinet committee, basically? Is that a regular monitoring, I think it's about understanding that it is a whole government effort, and job number one is do what you said you're going to do.
And how do you see the role of either the TUC as an external organisation with a clear interest in this, or the Industrial Strategy Council in holding them to account on those metrics or on the process?
I mean, I think the Industrial Strategy Council is literally done set, we will have an annual report and it's an opportunity to say, you said you would do all these things, have you done them? Basically, as well as thinking about, what are the metrics. As a TC, we're lobbying for our members' interests, we're lobbying for all their jobs, basically. And I think we will, price the government when it stepped in, as with JLR, and call them out when we think they haven't gone fast enough to protect those jobs.
And Nick, you obviously mentioned that you were involved in the ill-fated Industrial Strategy 2017. How do you see that difference between cross-government buy-in? Why did it fall apart the first time, and how do we keep it together this time?
It fell apart the first time because it was an unusual thing for the Conservative Party to do. And as soon as the sort of political patronage of the Prime Minister ceased to be there, then the sort of the political instincts of the party wrestled back control, and sort of you also did have a Chancellor who was raising it because he was Philip Hammond at the time. I mean, I'd be interested in Virginia's reflections on this as well, as her time with Sentance and in a political role. But I think that there is one major advantage here, which is the Chancellor. That hasn't happened before, and the point that Virginia absolutely rightly makes is that we do industrial strategy in this country. We've done it for decades with financial services because it sits in the Treasury. The Treasury is very powerful, and it sort of institutional heft to bring all of the other parts of the jungle together through the sort of process of Mansion House and all these other set pieces with the Chancellor does, so the Chancellor wields that power. So the fact that Rachel and her team bought into this agenda, and she is sort of the co-sponsor of the Industrial Strategy Council, is a very important position from what's happened before. On the sort of coordination point, I mean, this is absolutely like the crucial question about whether this is going to succeed or not. Again, the Treasury in itself, as a sort of a central and cross-cutting department, is a very, very useful advocate, and its processes in itself, through budget cycles and spending reviews, are naturally sort of cross-silo. And spending control is a very, very powerful tool. I do worry, though, that there is there is not really a match fit sort of coordination body elsewhere in government, and we see this in lots of other areas of policy where basically the Cabinet Office has never recovered from Jeremy Hayward ceasing to be the Cabinet Secretary, and I say this not to be disparaging of us concerns, but the Cabinet Office is not currently being able to do this coordinating across government particularly effectively, and that is a concern of mine. It will, I think, succeed if the Prime Minister continues to be sort of pushing the machine and asking the right questions, and that is really how sort of everyone is kept honest about against their objectives.
I just want to check, do you have anything to add to your former service?
I'll be really quick. I would say yes, we need a cabinet committee. I did set up the climate change cabinet committee, so I do love a good cabinet committee. I find them very effective. But the key thing here is that every department has a different metric against which it measures success, and I think that we've done a really good job at setting growth as that metric. So I was listening to Emma Reynolds speak yesterday in her new DEFRA portfolio, and she was saying, I want to show that DEFRA is the department for both environment and for growth, and we're part of that growth engine. So that's a really good sort of alignment, but ultimately there are going to be trade-offs that come through. And so the key thing about the Cabinet Committee is ultimately a good process can generate good policies because it creates the space to air some of those trade-offs that will still come through. There will unfortunately be trade-offs between security, net zero, growth, investment now, investment in the future, jobs now, jobs in the future. And so you need that space to air those, get the right analysis, right evidence, to make decisions that actually make sense as part of a bigger political vision. And so that's the value of the Cabinet Committee. And and why I think it's a good step that also helps balance some of that Treasury orthodoxy that comes through. I was former Treasury though.
So look, I'm obviously not being civil service and the role that it can play. I think having a clear set focus and direction is exceptionally important. I think often the local experience of achieving growth is that if you're not too careful, you can smother all hope of innovation through a kind of overstructured national reporting mechanism. So I think there's a fine line between everybody knowing the direction that they're pushing and what they want to achieve versus 670 policy papers updating in the progress and losing the role of experts. You know, under the last government, I cannot remember the number of science ministers that came to Manchester and was having me, a person with 3 humanities degrees, trying to explain genomics to them. Like, you know, to be a fly on the wall of that conversation would have been a delight in time. So we can lose sight of the fact that actually in this country we're blessed with lots of business experts, with lots of academic experts, and with people that have got out there, been out there delivering growth. You know, if you think about if the UK is to be at the forefront of the AI revolution, a policy paper isn't going to help us do that. Actually, we should be speaking to the unicorns that have cropped up all across the country from investors and innovators. I think the centre has a fantastic role in keeping people focused, in making that the driver of what people have to achieve, but also at times recognising that they are not the experts in the room. You know, the reason we've achieved the levels of growth that we have in Manchester is because we as politicians recognise that we are not always going to be the best person to be leading on a conversation about a sector that we don't always understand. So I think a balance, and I'm sure a kind of a cabinet committee will be very exciting, but there's a lot of other things that we might need to do if we actually want to see happen.
Yeah, I'm still reading from the fact you've got 3 degrees. You should work with the IPPR, not just be on that. Right. Well, let me be a bit more combative, but make probably the same point to our former civil service friends. So, frankly, what you're talking about is how does the civil service, how does central government maintain more control? Just maintain that control in a slightly different way. That's what that sounds like to me. Right?
I disagree. I think
it's more fun if we do it this way. There's not a match fit body in the government at the moment to coordinate some of this, and I would make the point, not similar to them, is that actually the place to make this work, the place to bring this all together is in place, right? It's in places like South Yorkshire. Because quite honestly, what's our track record in South Yorkshire creating growth? Well, roughly 4.1% over 20 years. What's the government's track record in creating growth? Not that. So if we're going to go to places where we can create growth and actually show that this can work, the way to do that is to empower places, say, right, okay, we're going to take the reins off, we're actually going to get a forego some control, we're going to let places take charge, experts in field do the things that they can do and do well, know their communities, and power that work going forward, because we've got a track record of apparently central government doesn't.
I'm going to do a 1 minute right of rebuttal to our civil service, and then I'm going to move us obviously off the Institute for Government's territory and back to IPPR territory and come to the audience and something a bit more democratic.
Yeah, I definitely think sort of implying that it should be led by the Cabinet Office. What I mean is that invariably you will need the government to do things to meet the expectations you're setting. Right? So, mayors are never going to be the bodies that are doing Northern Powerhouse Rail's DCO decision. Right? It's going to be the Transport Secretary, and if that decision is being taken too slowly, or the department is not leading the way on how to structure that railway as a key sort of industrial structure, infrastructure piece of work across the north. But you're going to have input on what that should look like, but the machine still needs to be sort of ridden to go quickly. Right? And likewise for attracting sort of co-investment through the National Wealth Fund, that is also going to require the business sector to be a bit more nimble. You talked about Holtec, right? That was ultimately an energy department competition and a treasury decision to only go for one bidder. So what I mean is that all the government departments are still going to be needing to work in concert and work quickly and be coordinated in order to deliver the objectives that you are rightly posting to the government as the ambition that you're setting.
I think the key bit is you need both, right? That's the main thing. So if you talk to any business, they will say we have both the onus of delivering growth put on us, but also in the very first autumn budget, we took the hit for funding the only tax rise that was talked about. And it doesn't take very long to have that kind of conversation. So the key thing is that you have to have both. You have to have the recognition that you have a huge set of actors that are going to play a part in generating our cultural justice strategy. But with that, you need this vision that comes from making those difficult prioritizations and those choices. I mean, for example, there was reluctance to name places within the industrial strategy, and despite the fact we have these incredible examples of place-driven growth, and that was a political decision that was too hard to do. So you have to have both. You have to have that political vision and that backing and those decisions that are going to come from Treasury on taxation and spend, but there has to be the conversations at a place-based level with businesses, with investors, with local people, and it just has to have both. And unfortunately, that's just the complexities of delivering government. It's hard.
Yeah, and my sense is that, like, I think the combination of the local growth plans from Oxford and the industrial strategy from Cllr and the National Wealth Fund Committee, all these strategic partnerships with local authorities can really make sure that those things are going in the right direction. Yeah,
So look, I'll throw this idea out there. There's a million reasons why it shouldn't happen, and I think good reasons why it could. Well, if we had a brave enough posture towards this, you mentioned Northern House Rail, right? Why would you not put, for argument's sake, the mayors together? Either you could put all the mayors in the Lords. You could say, right, okay, every mayor that gets elected, you get a lifetime appointment to the Lords, or you just get it attached to your role. You go in the Lords. You then get empowered by the government to sit on the committee, which is actually the committee is the mayors across the north who are sitting on the committee and telling the civil servants exactly what they need to do in order to deliver that scheme, and then they've got to go and do what we need in the north, not just go through central government and a bunch of people sitting in a room that we never get access to. The Northern House Rail Plan is being written at the moment without my input, other than me writing with Tracy and David Scape, David Blunkett, a white road rail plan that we've handed into the department, and it goes behind some closed doors, and then we, at some other point, they'll pop out the other end. We should be the ones driving that strategy, and there's no reason we couldn't restructure government to allow us to take this responsibility.
Oliver Coppard.
I just say two things. I think, to be nimble means that we have to be different. I think what we have at the moment means the government has to be different. I think that's what we're all saying. I suppose the only bit I was come back on is that kind of, our day-to-day jobs in places are speaking to businesses, and they're often speaking to businesses internationally. In the last 2 years alone, from Japan to Singapore to 3 different places in the US, through to European cities, big businesses are coming to us and saying, well, we know what your government would need to do to help us do it. All I think we're saying is that we've got some gentle private feedback as to how government could make that a lot better. And I think it's just making sure that conversation is in the room, because the number of big businesses that we've spoken to from across the world that want to come to the UK, I think is really exciting. And this is a country that's actually very small, so you can do things that benefit both Manchester and Sheffield, Manchester and Leeds, Manchester and Liverpool at the same time. And I think there's a real appetite to do that. The problem is fundamentally who then backs us up and we have that conversation.
Brilliant. Right, to the audience. Yeah, please. So then the glasses, and then at the back, so we'll take 3, and I'll take the far corner, just keep them running around.
Hello, I'm Sarah Hall. I'm the Executive Director at Positive Money, and I wanted to ask a question around the National Wealth Fund, which was mentioned a couple of times, which obviously will play a big role in driving the industrial strategy and regional growth. And my question is, should trade unions play a greater role in the governance of the fund in ensuring that conditions such as around job quality and unionization are applied to firms receiving financing?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Ross from the Independent Commission Neighbourhoods, alright? Question about politics rather than policy, but like, the point of all of this, or one of the points, is about business confidence, right? You have hundreds of pages of documents, hundreds of measures. You're basically saying, we have a plan of which all measures contribute to change the country over 10 years. In these sectors, we have a relative strength. In these places, we want to see it across the country. That's the point of all of this, right? But then we're in this weird sort of place now, which is like, the party who is currently leading the polls is basically saying that if you're a business who wants to invest in projects to support North Powerhouse Rail, don't, because we're not interested. Or if you want to invest in, I don't know, clean energy projects in Greater Lincolnshire or something like that, like, don't, because we don't want to do that. I suppose the short question is like, what do you do? Like, how do you keep the show on the road so that we are continuing on that path?
Oh, we keep it the government show on the road.
Yeah.
Great. And last one over in that.
Hi, good morning. My name is Vanessa Fury. I'm from the Institution of Civil Engineers. So we've touched on a few of the things that have been published at the moment, but the government has set out a very ambitious plan, including a modern industrial strategy, an infrastructure strategy. There is going to be an integrated transport strategy. They're going to deliver clean energy by 2030, and they are going to build 1.5 million homes. That's a lot, and there's a lot of people that are trying to decarbonise. So one of the things we're looking at, trying to understand, is there's a real chance here for being key pinch points in areas, be it supply chains, be it workforce, be it investment. And I said earlier about trying to do everything all at once. I mean, this is stuff that's looking to be delivered in the next 5 to 10 years, not building skills for the longer term. What are the things that you think government need to be doing to ensure that we aren't tripping over our own feet and trying to end up delivering nothing by trying to deliver everything at the same time?
Thank you. And that is a very live debate in investment strategy. I don't know if any of you followed the Joe Biden everything bagel debate, which is my government here is trying to do various different things. So I'm not going to ask Kate the change because I think we know your question. But I mean, I think I recommended similar things. So actually, Alex, I'm interested in your perspective on potentially if you're interacting with government finance, government institutions, businesses' perspective on things like eligibility, things like criteria about trade union representation, or their voices coming through those financial institutions. How do you see it from where you are?
It's an interesting one. I mean, I think, the way that we're regulated, I think the way that we raise funds, just be in that sort of particular conversation. But I think the role of working with trade unions, understanding perspectives and bringing those together and making sure that as we are collectively developing these plans, that we are optimising what we're doing and mechanisms to influence your voices. More generally, but I guess in terms of my particular focus, that's it.
Business workers, I'll come to non-authority representatives on the
Vanessa, I think, can I just try and link the question that Vanessa asked, the question that Russ asked, because I think they are related to how do we keep things in place, but how do we also in that overarching sense of direction and purpose. And from my perspective, it is about empowering people like me, people like there to be able to solve some of those problems on the ground, which will be blockages if we're not careful. So things like Steve Rotherham, who always mentions this whenever we talk to the Prime Minister about housing, he says we haven't got enough bricklayers. Because right now, all the bricklayers are earning more money being bricklayers than they will be in colleges training other bricklayers to be bricklayers. So you've got a shortage of courses, so you've got a shortage of bricklayers, so the price keeps going up and you're in this vicious cycle. Things like brownfield housing fund money, if we don't get that unlocked, then what we're going to find is that the viability to get the housing in the north in particular is going to be too great. We're not going to build those. And we need to, there are some things we just need to give to mayors, give to local authorities to unlock the potential of our places going forward so that we can actually deliver at pace and scale against the government's objectives. But I don't think that the government being ambitious and laying out all these different strategies is a bad thing. Personally, I want them to be ambitious. You're absolutely right, we're not careful. We'll have all these grand strategies to get the things that could unlock those grand strategies that could happen on the ground today aren't being done, and therefore in 3, 5, 10 years' time we won't deliver the things that are promised.
And I think I would share that actually. I think change, the ambition is actually something that's really heartening because it gives people a clear direction. And for a long time, I don't think that we've had a nod to business that actually this is going to be a coherent priority for a long period of time. So invest now in your skills pipeline, invest now because there will be something that follows in the years to come. I do think, and I think this is the point around what national government can do, there are loads of things that just get in our way from a regulatory standpoint that could be flexed, that could be dealt with, that could be picked up nationally with a bit of focus and energy. You know, if you think about some of the pace around development, we talked a lot about planning. We perhaps didn't talk enough about the statutory consultees and the role that some of those organisations play. You know, I've got a site in Manchester that will have 1,500 homes, that will create 500 jobs, and I'll have a new school. But it's stuck going through the EA's remediation of brownfield plan, and it's been trapped in there for 18 months. Or I had a new development on site in the city centre that was stuck with the BSR for another 16 months before it got. So there are things that we can press on and put resource into that makes them that easier. I think the longer term thing though is about having a coherent pipeline over the next decade that does all of these things, and that does mean that we have to think of our skills system differently. It means that rather than just thinking about old traditional sectors, we'll have a skills plan for those that are in residential, we'll have a skills plan for those in life sciences, actually turning that on its head around a skills plan for all of those that are part of building, of infrastructure, of growth, and having some coherency around that. And then I suppose the other point around keeping the show on the road, particularly with the climate that we're in, and I think this comes to attention that every government will always have. How do you plan to feel like you're doing everything, everywhere, whilst concentrating on an evidence approach to the places that will build and the places that will grow first? And I think if we're going into the next election without something concrete that every place can point to that says this is what it means, we will not win that election. So it means that we will have to do some clear thinking with innovation around focusing in the areas that are growing, but we will have to do things everywhere that people understand and can point to. And the reason I say that is in Manchester we focus really hard on growth over the last 2 decades, but I have never once spoken to my residents about growth. I've never once spoken to them about GVA. I've talked about the homes we're building, the jobs we're creating, the opportunities for them and the kids and the places they live in. So that's the next trick, and that's the trick of government. How do you translate an ambitious industrial strategy with all of the infrastructure enablers into something that people can get on the doorstep in their place?
Okay. Anything to add on any of this?
I mean, brilliant. I think that relentless focus on jobs and the jobs that the national strategy is going to deliver is absolutely vital. And I think sometimes government, you know, rightly wants to talk about raising business investment. As Beth says, that's not really going to get with hearts racing in most of our communities or with most of the people we talk to every day. So that relentless focus on jobs. And that is also the answer to that planning and coordination problem, because those are where the skills bottlenecks are. And sometimes I think we should kind of frame this as a good problem to have. Like, it's great that we need local promotion of good college jobs. It's so great in some ways we've got a shortage of well-paid jobs. It's a great qualification. There are opportunities across the country. There's good paid, great unionised jobs. We should be framing these as challenges which we want to grapple with. We want to say it. And my formation to be able to build our infrastructure, to be able to deliver our to actually rebuild manufacturing businesses, to deliver the things we need. I think we could communicate about that and live with it.
One of the great effects of government doing lots of things is around Wales you had Hinkley, you had the Celtic Sea building offshore wind, floating offshore wind, and you had the drive of Walkers not too far away building submarines. That competition for workers really drove up the wages for welders, and that's the fantastic as an individual welders.
Yeah, I don't have a huge amount of expand. I would just say on the point about some competing priorities, your list sounded like a really, really good agenda for government. I'm multi-biased. But the critical difference here, I think, is to think about why did we choose 10 years? And it's because all of the things we're trying to achieve, whether it's housing, infrastructure, industrial strategy, is about sending signals to the organisations the government needs to partner with, whether or not they are employers or the private sector that this is a plan for long-term investment now. And I don't think that by going long-term, you reduce the tension and competition between the different strategies that you go for because every single one of them are going to want to invest predominantly in skills, as you just said. That's only a good thing. What it means is we're going to have, and to the point about prioritisation, I'm actually quite comfortable we're going to have a retail and hospitality sector because actually it would be really good for so fewer people who work in retail and hospitality and more of them doing welding jobs. Then on the point about reform and certainty, I mean, the government will rightly live and die on success and whether or not it has made a success of the things it said it was going to do. And that is about instilling that confidence in the businesses that investment is all well and good, but what does investment mean? It means new greenfield investment in warehouses, in factories, in data centres, in labs, in all of these other things, and investment in people, the skills, and investment in them through their high wages. And unless we can show that we've made progress in all these communities, then rightly people will take a different route. And so we've just got to get on with it. And to be honest, I think we just got to ignore the polls for 3 years. You typically it was just political cycles of the
I
past.
say that's an election.
National. We're only 14 months into this poll. This sort of acting as though it's a general election tomorrow, and that is partly our fault. I think we need to get into a bit more of we need to actually deliver the stability that we've got with a large parliamentary majority and just get on with stuff. Just be a bit more focused on humdrum stuff that's actually way more important to delivering the incremental change that people desperately need and not have decades.
Great, thanks. Any other thing about saying, especially something roughly about 2 terms?
Right. So just to add on the confidence piece, because we talked a lot about skills, which is all important and right, but we just got to talk about energy prices for businesses. That's what businesses say again and again and again. If they want to invest, if they want to grow, it's energy prices, and that's something that came out of the industrial strategy and hasn't yet happened and needs to be tackled.
Yeah.
That's the other side of
getting
the coin with skills.
consultation to view what the support mechanism is.
Yes.
Right, we can do another round if people are asked this because the wonderful first question is just ask a very specific question. So we're going to go here, on the left, and then
Hi, I'm Jake Taylor, Deputy Leader in Brighton Hove City Council, lead on finance and city regen. I'll try and keep it quick. Distinction between economic growth and economic transformation. In Brighton and Hove since 2010, we've had relatively strong GPA productivity growth, but we've become more unequal. We've got higher child poverty, and our health inequalities have got even more drastically worse over that period. So how can we use industrial strategy to actually transform the economy within growth, and do panel members have any specific examples of where that's actually worked?
Thank you very much.
Hi there, Luke Mills from Bloomberg NEF, where you do strategic research. Probably a question more towards Alice. So, the UK has a supply chain of bigger equipment. It also, Coppard was saying, we've got skills building up really fast as well. One of the areas of report that we recently did that could help with that is standardisation of kit, preferably from manufacturers. I'd love to hear your views on what can be done from the government's help.
Thank you very much. And then
Thank you very much. Mark Buckingham from Bayer, the German company. Can the panel comment on this interaction of trade policy with industrial strategy? We're concerned about some of the effects of trade decisions, the giveaway of our bioethanol industry in the Northeast in the recent US trade deal and in the proposed EU trade deal. The EU, in exchange for making trade easier, the EU is asking full control of our agricultural and food regulation, which is a potential very large challenge to innovation going forward. So fantastic 10-year industrial strategy. how can we make sure we can avoid trade policy diminishing the opportunity going forward?
I think, yeah, that's in the connection between trade and strategic finance. So what I'll do is I want to come on those after this first presentation, and also ask you for any closing remarks. In particular, I want you to imagine that Peter Carter's just snuck in and sat at the back of the room. And what is the thing that he needs to hear from you? Alice, to start on standardisation.
Thank you. Yes, so standardisation and being referred to in different ways, so there'd been at the moment quite keen to talk a bit more about harmonisation. That's because there's a sort of a reality to connecting to an installed network that has been for over 60 years means there's always a backward compatibility aspect. So we're not talking about greenfield, we are talking about really specifically about integrating the aspects, which has not been put in a standardised way over time. So there's potentially more benefit to get from talking about harmonisation and common understanding of standards rather than I think it gets oversimplified to the idea. But in terms of the unlocks for that, actually a lot of what we've talked about today, long-term plans and anticipatory investment does mean we can move into more of a kind of a convoy type mindset. To build 20 substations a year, they're all going to look like this, and we're going to roll them out like that. So long-term planning, choices, industrial strategy does all support with that. Secondly, I would say there is a period of planning discussion, and there's work underway with both the NISA, the Energy System Operator, and Ofgem on some predefined design standards. So sort of, planning legislation currently or guidance already reflects things like preference versus in-ground substation design, for example, that isn't clear guidance on switch-out technology choice with very, very different implications for size and footprint of the substation, with every planning authority taking a different view on their appetite for different substation designs. So there's something to achieve there with guidance and planning. And finally, I would say on regulation, again, this kind of working framework, predetermined balanced scorecards, which we are working with the regulator on, guidance, will all help things look forward from there. So at the moment, or historically, I would say, it's like frankly, it's been more normal to say, can I show that this specific investment is the most economic for this specific case or this specific customer? And that by its very nature drives convergence. But actually, when you start talking about standardization, you might see that an individual substation or line might not be the most economic portfolio as a whole is more economic on standardization. So it's that link between anticipation investment, regulatory framework, planning standards is a big part of it. And of course, there's a lot we can do ourselves, and a lot we are doing in the supply chain. So through our long-term partnerships, we are developing standards for the 35 million investment channel for the next 5 years. And really elaborate infrastructure work.
So I'm going to work from that side today to answer those remaining two questions and then we close remarks. I'm going to do Virginia.
Okay, I'll be really quick. I'm just going to pick up on one of the questions about trade. I think there's a big gap about the implementation of the industrial strategy, and I guess it comes back to my thoughts about resilience in our supply chains. And if you take things like the Cllr example, great, that 1.5 billion is so important, but the reality is that a lot of businesses don't know what their supply chains look like, and that funding has gone to one place, but it needs to support the supply chain, but we don't know where it sits, and a lot of it sits abroad. So that link between the domestic and the international, the gap at the moment in government, I think is something that needs to be worked on a lot more. And then my point to Peter would be talk to businesses. Just keep talking to businesses. It's not just the big incumbents, it's the innovators, SMEs, like large majority of the UK's businesses are SMEs. So talk to businesses and hear about the experiences of actually trying to grow a business, and it really puts your eye into perspective about what really matters.
I like points of Peter, I think that's really second when we do that. Nick.
Yeah, thank you. So your first question was about sort of growth that is more equal with health inequalities as a particular concern. I mean, the industrial strategy is not just about it is one part of the wider growth strategy, which I think is also inherent within the industrial strategy, but also the wider economic policy is more broad-based growth than we've had. So obviously, we've mentioned quite a lot about how uneven the growth strategy in the UK has been focused on services, has been very, very good for tax revenue, has been very, very good for the wages of those people who benefits. But more broadly across the country, we have we have increasing inequality, and we have lots of social consequences as a result of that, but then feeding into economic consequences, particularly through poor health outcomes. The industrial strategy, I think, with bringing greater balance, both geographically but also sort of sectorally, is about a more broader base growth, and it also sits in a wider strategy, which is about devolving power away from Westminster, which I'm a great fan of, and also about increasing house building, including social housing, so that we can bear down on those markers of economic insecurity that also then feed into poor health outcomes, poor education outcomes. I'm looking forward to seeing some progress on the child poverty strategy coming through soon. And so the industrial strategy is one route, but it's part of a much broader piece of work, which is about inclusive growth and inclusive growth that shares the proceeds much broader constituency of people. And that, I think, is the key to the sort of electoral strategy for the next generation as well.
Good. Thank you. I think just on the trade point, the research relationships with the EU is an essential part of I mean, the really good question about what does this actually mean to anybody? How do we have an industrial strategy that delivers not just growth, but growth that leads in better jobs and living standards? I think we have to keep at the heart of all those difficult choices across the industrial strategy. And we've heard some of them today. I think, do you have a slightly less competitive strike price, as I said, or do you create some more jobs in the local community? And I think it's been I think we've had to work quite hard to get that point across, so there are different points of growth that have impacts on people's living standards. Two areas where I think we need to keep making that point. Some of the discussion about AI, I think, is a little bit, well, never mind, it will just destroy jobs and that's fine because it will deliver us great growth. And I think we need to, that's a massive caricature, but it's not totally a caricature, basically. So I think we need to think about what we're doing in that discussion. And then the other area is regulation. Like, of course, there's scope for more efficient, better targeted, more effective regulation. But many of the regulations that sometimes we get complaints about they're about regulating markets so that they deliver for everyone. I think if we think about the industrial strategy as not just a platform for growth, but to drive up growth so that it makes people's lives better, that will help us with those things.
Last minute,
Thank you. I'm glad you didn't ask me specifically the question about standardisation. Wasn't my area of expertise. So I'm going to answer the question from David, which I think is probably the most important question of the whole session, which is how do we make sure economic growth doesn't keep our peoples? And in Rotherham, that's to a large extent actually so far kind of the danger. And so we've seen huge growth, but actually it's got to be more than just growth, productivity growth. It's got to actually be more money in people's pockets and more that they're making. Nobody creating just bigger companies. And if it means that people that actually have more money in their pocket, we're not going to get re-elected on that basis, quite honestly. So, for me, the answer is the wellbeing question. That is how we do that. We make sure that, as we've already said, we make sure that we are making different decisions that might have different incentives within them to allow us to create those jobs that will get people the wages growth, the jobs growth that we need in order to get this government re-elected, but perhaps to get Labour colleagues re-elected as well.
Interesting time, Deborah. So it's felt historically when we've gone out with trade policy that we haven't really had a long-term plan to use to form our trade policy. So within that, kind of, it's not just when inward investment, it's from whether you can also see itself in the future. having a long-term plan helps us commit to British business interests going forward. That's the point of resilience. And then the second thing to me to your question about good growth, you cannot disconnect economic policy or social policy. Industrial strategy and that alone will not fix structural issues in our economy or in our society, and all the government needs to work to make sure that British are growing.
If I could just hear a big round of applause for our